The pensioners have got, the triple lock. They've got inflation built in. If interest rates goes up, great for them. They've got savings. That electorate is not very bothered. The actual electorate, I think, is very, very bothered. All the arguments, I think, are going to come back and get you. You can't say, I'm Thatcherite, and then someone says, well, she put a windfall tax on. And then you have to say, oh, right, well, maybe we should then. The narrative they're trying to sell, which I'm constantly trying not to allow them to sell, is, Boris Johnson had to leave because never in history have so many people from one government left it. That's a Tory government. They all left. They said, we can't work for you anymore. There's no plot here. There's no deep state. Now that can't be forgotten. And for them suddenly to say, well, what we needed was to be more right-wing, that isn't what happened.
Ian Hislop, hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Yeah, all right. I was sort of very up because Boris Johnson has gone, and a bit down because I've had a look at who's going to succeed him.
We know what's happening next, yes. We'll get to that in good time, but
Good.
The reason for our meeting is your BBC Sounds documentary, Suburbia, out now. It focuses on suburban life in Britain and the art and literature, the culture that stems from it.
Yes.
I would implore viewers, it's not as mundane as you might initially think. It's very, very interesting, and we'll get to that. But first, in your own words, tell us what the series is about.
Well, I said to a friend, I'm doing a series about, the culture that comes out of suburbia, and he said, oh, that'll be short then. And I thought, well, that's exactly what everyone thinks, that suburbia is dull and boring and mediocre and mundane. And it struck me that actually most people in this country live in suburbia. I mean, that is actually true. And also, suburbia itself has given rise to a huge amount of British culture. And I felt there's quite a lot of snobbery about suburbia. And if you go back to the beginning, the turn of the 20th century, what you got was criticism from both the rich and the poor. So anyone who moved to suburbia, the rich people are going, oh God, ghastly. They want their little bit of garden, their horrid little house. Obviously fine for me to have a very large house and a very big garden, but it's awful they want it. And then the people left behind in the city thought, you've sold us out, you've all gone. What happened to, the community that you were meant to support? So left-wing writers thought, ghastly suburbia, why can't they be in the cities and, show proper working class solidarity with us? And then the rich felt, you're all awful. What are you doing? So I felt there was a real snobbery about anything that came out of suburbia. And that was reflected in the culture. So I had a look at that of a lot of writers. And then there was essentially a turn where people started saying, actually, is it so bad to want a bit of your own space and a bit of green, a bit of garden? Okay, it's not the countryside, it's not the city, but it's quite an interesting mix of the two. And a lot of artistic movements started coming out of that. And you ended up with a poet like Betjeman, who was a great celebrator of the suburbs. And then, classic pattern in the suburbs, the parents move out looking for space. The children think, God, this is boring. And that's where this huge wave of pop music arrived. I opened with that song by the Members, The Sound of the Suburbs, but you could have chosen The Jam, or you could have chosen Ray Davies and the Kinks, or any number of teenage movements of people in their bedrooms looking out the window thinking, get me out of here.
Before we get on to rejecting the mundanity
Yeah.
of the suburbs, let's entertain the possibility that they might be mundane.
Yes.
Do you think there can still be beauty within the mundane?
Yes. I mean, I think it's a particular type of beauty. It's not dramatic. It's not a waterfall. It's not a castle. It's not a country church. It's a lawn. It's a beautifully kept lawn. Or it's a small bit of space which is your own. I think what is interesting is that the people who embraced that, starting off with the late Victorian, essentially, I mean, it was a lot of religious people who went. It was nonconformists, sort of certain bunch of Anglicans saying the city is not only dirty and unpleasant to live in, they're quite corrupt. This is a chance to live a cleaner, more idealistic life. And it's interesting, every single other religious community, the Jewish community did it themselves, came into the East End, started moving into the suburbs. And the older Jews saying, what happened to the East End community? What happened to our lives together? You know, you're miles away from a synagogue. So it's all right, we'll build some synagogues. You know, Golders Green, it's fine. You know, so they did it. And then the Asian community has done the same more recently. And that's really interesting in the programme, with a lot of people just suddenly finding, we've come to Britain, we're put in the cities, we don't like them much, we're going to move out. And Hanif Qureshi, who wrote The Buddha of Suburbia, is incredibly funny about his father coming to Britain and saying to him, I've just come from India, we've been in turmoil, I want somewhere quiet, and loving
Bromley.
the suburbs. Whereas Hanif himself ends up saying, all I wanted to do was get out. And nowadays, you know, my favourite thing about Bromley is going through it on the Eurostar.
It's perpetual tension, isn't it, between the parent and the child in that kind of environment. Yeah, I wanted to ask you more, because you mentioned there the Victorian era, the 20s, the 70s.
Yes.
What it is you think suburbia tells us about modern Britain in particular?
What I think it tells you is that modern Britain has exactly the same desires as its Victorian 20s and 70s counterparts. As soon as the pandemic struck, you had a movement out. People thinking, OK, we're stuck in the city. Do we have to stay here? And people who thought the only place to be is, you know, where urban music is. I mean, there's not a big emphasis on suburban music, is there? You know, this is edgy, this is politically interesting, this is fun. Thinking, is it? Maybe we could go out. And, you know, and there's been a big exodus post-pandemic from London. And I think people will do it again. We had a great sort of architectural historian in who basically said, architects have all been saying it's time for densification. You should all live densely, and we should build up, and everyone should go back to the city. And all over the world, Australia, America, and particularly Britain, people are saying, no, we won't, thank you. On the whole, we'll do what we want to do, and not what you want. And that means inevitably, I mean, it is this sort of strain of individualism. I want my own space. I don't actually want to live that communally.
So the more things change, the more they stay the same, perhaps.
They do. I mean, I couldn't believe it. The best and funniest book is Diary of a Nobody, was written in the 1890s, in which the son of Charles Booter, who's moved to the suburbs, says, I don't want to rot away in the suburbs. I mean, this is 1890.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that as I've got older, when I first read this book, I thought, Lupin, the son, he's great. He's terrific. What an idiot his father is. God, he's boring. Pottering around in suburbia with his house and his plants and his hobbies. I hate him. Now I read it again and I think, now you see, Charles Booter, he's a good bloke. And that idiot son of his.
So it's an interesting point, because I think if you look historically at this, you can go back to Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare enchants England as this Arden, this mythical place where the rural is sacred ground, that there's this pastoral idyll. And then you progress, you move through, you say it about Blake, you can say it about Wordsworth, the examples you've given, and eventually you get to Betjeman. And maybe that's because the art and the literature isn't so much a study of the pastoral, it's a study of place, it's a study of home. So would you agree then that the art and the culture that surrounds the suburbs can be viewed as a continuation of that tradition, and even though the subject matter, the location is different, it's actually
about home.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is really important. And Betjeman is interesting because he began quite snobby about the suburbs. There was sort of stuff about, pass the fish knives, and, you know, isn't everyone in the suburbs amusingly common? And then, you know, after about 10 years, you know, Betjeman became the champion of the suburbs, and he found it a place of extraordinary sort of beauty and character, and wrote poems celebrating it. And I think what he identified was, which is a very, very British quality, is people really care about their homes, and they make a sort of virtue of this space. And actually, a number of our contributors were really interesting. I mean, Hanif Qureshi, again, he said, the joke is it's full of bored teenagers writing in their own bedroom. And he said, up to about the 50s, they didn't have their own bedroom. They shared their bedroom with other kids. And also they didn't go to their bedroom because they didn't have central heating. So he said, when we got central heating, your own bedroom, and you could go in the lawn and, have a smoke. These are not small things, in the life of a creative artist or anyone else.
Absolutely, and the suburbs can also be viewed perhaps as the home of British consumerism in that sense, because you mentioned central heating there, but also washing machines, other items like that in the past. And as we move towards the modern world now, you could say the same for, an iPhone 13 Pro Max. You could say the same for the 2 cars parked on the driveway. You could say the same for the DFS sofa, most likely also bought on credit. And in the modern world, the modern time, particularly the one we're in now, as RPI increases, inflation increases, interest rates increase, there's this huge political constituency of people who have these modern comforts, and their quality of life is about to get significantly worse as the cost of living crisis spirals.
Yes, and the interesting thing about almost all art that comes out of suburbia, and there's a lot of novels, the sitcom, which I think is the ultimate suburban art form, which is absolutely phenomenal and brilliant in Britain. It's all about precariousness. It's all about, you've got here, but you might lose it. And have you got enough money to stay there? And have you got the status that you think you've got by being here? And are you about to lose it? So you have all those, from The Good Life to Hyacinth Bouquet, of suburban people who are slightly worried that they've got out and they're going to fall back in again. And that creates both incredible comedy and a certain underlying angst.
So, absolutely. So, politically then, right now, as the cost of living bites, could you see the suburbs developing a class consciousness? Could the suburbs become the home of political revolution in Barrett Britain?
And again, the only really famous classical music composer was a communist who lived in the suburbs and decided that he wrote sort of very, very sort of socialist, realist classical operas about, the triumph of the working man.
That's taking your message to the people you want to get it to.
Well, actually, he wrote an opera about Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt. I mean, obviously written in suburbia, not actually in the countryside. So you may have a point. There's nothing to stop that suburban, huge majority thinking this is going to hit us all the hardest.
What is it, about 70%, 80% of people in Britain living there now?
Yeah.
So, to take it explicitly political then,
yes.
What hope do you think we have with Sith Lord Truss coming in of adequately addressing the problems, the cost of living crisis that we're facing?
Well, so far it doesn't look very good. But the election we're witnessing is an election with a very, very tiny constituency of people who largely aren't affected by this. I mean, the pensioners have got, the triple lock. They've got inflation built in. If interest rates goes up, great for them. They've got savings. That electorate is not very bothered. The actual electorate, I think, is very, very bothered. And any incumbent Prime Minister, no matter how sort of showboating they've been on the trail, is going to have to sit down, with the Treasury and say, great, we're going to borrow money. And the Treasury's going to say, no, we're not, because no one wants to lend us any anymore. There is a slight problem with any more borrowing due to, we have to sell these bonds to people. So, and there is a problem with cutting taxes. There's less of a problem with raising taxes because you're going to have to do it anyway, and you might as well admit it early. So reality is going to whack. I mean, I think the interesting thing is, do we have Liz Truss? And does she adapt to the actual circumstances? Or do we have a complete ideologue who is going to do it anyway?
Yeah, there's winning the election she's faced with now and the one she'll have to fight next. And if she sticks
and they
to
couldn't be more different.
Absolutely.
And I do think, because of the furlough, and, whatever anyone in the Tory party now says, the government response to the furlough was not traditionally conservative, but was hugely effective.
Yeah.
And the public has seen that once, and they've thought you can act the traditional cry of, well, I'm afraid we just can't do anything, it didn't happen. They did do something. And all the arguments, I think, are going to come back and get you. You can't say, I'm Thatcherite, and then someone says, well, she put a windfall tax on. And then you have to say, oh, right, well, maybe we should then. And then you can't have the other side saying, we want to nationalise, the water companies and the power companies, and notice that most of the population are very for this, including your own voters. So a lot of the rhetoric, it's got to give.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that point, the opening one you made is the most astute one, which is that the contest, the Tory leadership contest right now, it inhabits an alternate reality to the one
completely
that the rest of the electorate is experiencing right now.
Well, I mean, there's a very good private eye cartoon that said that the Tory party has a worst past the post system, which I'm afraid it does.
I saw your cover the other week, which was, I think, inside the Tory leadership contest, dead and still voting, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I'm afraid that was true. I mean, it is an utter anomaly that we are now in a position where they decide the Prime Minister at a time when, again, the sooner you act, the better. They gave it months.
Yeah.
The current caretaker Prime Minister told us all it was really important he stayed around to cover this, and then has refused to take any decisions at all.
Went on holiday.
Yeah. He's decided to go on holiday to Slovenia and Greece and do some jollies. I mean, why doesn't he just go paintballing for a month if he wants to put on a flak jacket? I mean, it's cheaper for us. We don't have to pay for the typhoon to fly around.
What do you think the caretaker Prime Minister's legacy will be?
Nothing. Literally nothing. I mean, it should be just a reminder that don't allow sort of amoral narcissists to become Prime Minister. I think that's an important legacy.
Constitutionally, you made me think about this. You're right. The last three Prime Ministers in the space of 6 years have been decided by the Conservative selectorate, haven't they?
Yeah.
It's not been by election. It's not been...
No.
It's this very small group of people who have this hold over the political life of the country.
And they're a particular wing of the Conservative Party.
Yes.
Even at the moment, they don't represent the MPs that are in Parliament.
They're more right-wing.
Yeah, much more right-wing. And they're going to put in yet another candidate who basically owes the fact they're there to this small rump of the party. I mean, the narrative they're trying to sell, which I'm constantly trying not to allow them to sell, is, Boris Johnson had to leave because never in history have so many people from one government left it. That's a Tory government. They all left. They said, we can't work for you anymore. There's no plot here. There's no deep state. I mean, sadly, the left had nothing to do with it at all.
Yeah.
It was purely his own party got rid of him. Now, that can't be forgotten. And for them suddenly to say, well, what we needed was to be more right-wing, that isn't what happened.
Yeah. But you mentioned the left there. Another interesting recent political development is the kind of surging popularity of trade unions over the summer, really. What do you think that speaks to? Because that's quite unusual in British political history.
Yeah, well, that's because you're quite young. And again, I mean, I do feel watching sort of British politics, you think, well, part of the problem is our political class has forgotten what industrial action looks like. So, for those of us who were around in the 70s and 80s, a trade union goes on strike and says, we want a pay rise. As a government, you don't throw up your hands and say, oh my God, what do we do? You don't say, oh, we should ban trade unions and stop people asking. No, that's what trade unions do, you see. They represent their members who want more money and they ask for it. Your job is to get them in and say, oh, all right, I'll give you about half of that. Can you give us something back in return so we don't look completely terrible? And you sort it out. Mm-hmm. That's the job. That's government. And particularly in an era with rising inflation. What do you think people are going to do? Sit at home thinking, oh yeah, I think I'd better have a 12% pay cut. That looks good. It's not going to happen. So again, I think there's been an extraordinary post-Thatcher period where the unions didn't matter because it was a period of prosperity. And we're now in a period where, as everyone's noticed, we're having a bit of a problem. So, historically the answer isn't give everybody a full inflationary pay increase, because that doesn't help inflation much. Then it goes up again the following year. Nor is tough luck, sit it out until inflation goes down. People don't want to hear that either.
Where do you think the Labour Party is in this? Because the trade unions they've caused a bit of a headache for Keir Starmer, haven't they? Because they're essentially the advocate of a progressive, at the moment anyway, of a progressive politics in Britain. They've outflanked him.
Yeah. Again, well, this is the problem you get into. I mean, Starmer is sort of trying to be Blair, but he's actually looking rather like Kinnock. And I don't know if you remember Neil Kinnock during the miners' strike. He kept saying, yeah, I'll turn up to a picket line one day. I've got a bit of a diary clash. I just can't do it this way. And you just, if you're trying to please, again, this is two electorates, isn't it, really?
Yes, exactly.
You get into trouble. But I think when you're leader of the opposition, there's a lot of room to be more daring. And you can go and stand on a picket line, and then if you get voted in 3 years' time, you say, yes, it was a perfectly legitimate protest, but they're asking too much, and we can't afford it, so we'll offer less. It's not as difficult as it looks to stand as an opposition leader for a change of government. I don't think that's the point. I don't think that's that hard. And if you sit on the fence, again, the public just notice. It's the idea you're saying, this is a really cunning move, you see. I'm not going to support them, but I sort of am going to. I think, yeah, people notice.
Pick a side.
Yeah.
The Eye's kind of not been ahead of this, but has covered extensively the companies that these trade unions are taking on. You know, Centrica, BP, Shell, any of the, well, I don't know the names of them because they were basically set up the day after the pandemic started, but all of these COVID companies making colossal profits. What do you think it speaks to in British political culture, society, our economy, that we do have this kind of rentier capitalism, these companies just skimming out of the public purse?
Yeah, well, I think it's disgraceful. And, a traditional Tory party would have thought the same. Tories I grew up would have said, who are this ghastly bunch of spivs? They're taking us all for a ride. Stop it.
Yeah.
Again, I think people are perfectly reasonable to say, why not a windfall tax on you? If pre-COVID your profits were 3p and afterwards they're 500 million, I think we could have a bit of that. That seems to be only fair and not even very political to suggest it. And, the processing and the commissioning and the ordering bits of government, which is, require a functioning civil service, have rather packed up. And you are left with, a very reduced group of people. If you appoint on political terms your civil service, you don't get much expertise. So you've got... I know, amazing, isn't it? It's just an incredible thought. It's like Matt Hancock's mate from the pub.
Yeah.
Apparently he's not brilliant at getting the price of PPE stuff down. Well, who'd have known? You do need people who can do those boring bits. Because, not only are they not ultimately boring, but they're the only thing that matters.
And still being paid for it as well, being paid well, because
I
think it was, again, in the Eye, there was a little nib about Grant Shapps urging pay restraint for the unions, etc. And then, lo and behold, the executive board member of DFT, he's got a nice little bung and his salary's gone up by about 10, 15 grand. Yeah.
After a period of COVID where no one went on the train. I mean, it's not a time for bonuses, is it? Terrific. No one was there because they were at home because we had COVID. I mean, it's just not bonus time at the moment. I don't think you have to be incredibly radical or left-wing, as obviously I am both, to suggest that perhaps when everyone else is suffering, you shouldn't really give yourself a huge whack.
Come here talking about how left-wing you are, Ian Hislop.
Yes.
Why haven't you been on the picket line? When are you going to make your appearance on the picket line?
Well, you see, I mean, as I've frequently discussed, our circulation of private eye is very heavily dependent on various sections keeping working. So I draw the line.
Get back out there,
get back out there.
Ian, I understand you've also written a play.
Yes.
About Spike Milligan.
Yes. Because the theatres all shut down during lockdown, my friend Nick Newman and I, who I've written with for ages, had a play we wanted to write about Spike Milligan, who was the founder of the Goons and in our opinion, one of the funniest people who've ever been in British comedy. And we had a very celebratory play. And a lot of plays about comedians basically say, oh God, he was miserable really, and he had a miserable life and you should be miserable, and then you leave the theatre. And we wanted to write a play saying, Spike was unbelievably funny, and people had a great time when they went to see him, and here's a play about people having a great time, and then you can leave. And we hope you have a great time. So we've written a very specific play about the first sort of few years of the Goon Show on BBC Radio, which Spike Milligan did with Peter Sellers, who later became a film star, and Harry Seacombe, who was a Welsh tenor. But all three of them had met when they came out the army. And it was just a great moment in British comedy. Three working class comedians. They'd been funny, in uniform. They arrived in London thinking, how do we do this again? And the BBC took them in, and Spike in particular thought, I've just spent 5 years dealing with the officer class telling me I'm useless. And they're there again at the BBC.
And there's kind of this battle, isn't there? There's a tension between him and the BBC.
And we found a fantastic set of correspondence between Spike and various sort of BBC functionaries, which we put into the play from the BBC archive, which is just terrific. Because they just don't understand Spike at all. And everything's loud, and there's sort of explosions in all the sketches, which is, because Spike got blown up during the war. And at one point the BBC tells him that the whole programme is far too loud, and he says, well, why don't you stand further away from the wireless? I mean, Spike's jokes are brilliant. And his dealings with the Beeb are incredibly funny. I mean, mostly he's complaining about money. I'm not being paid enough and the repeats are terrible. I mean, which won't surprise anyone in any of the business now. But also he's incredibly funny about the process of celebrity. I mean, my favourite bits is someone comes up to him and Harry Seacombe loves it. They say, I loved your show, you're marvellous. Oh, they're all grinning. And then the fan says to Seacombe, he says, tell us a joke. Spike says, no. And the bloke says, well, then tell us a joke, you're a comedian. And he says, what do you do? And the bloke says, I'm a carpenter. He says, all right, make me a table. Which is sort of classic Spike. There's a bit of an edge, but it's funny enough to be charming.
Do you see a little bit of yourself, perhaps?
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we end up the play by mentioning all the people who he influenced. The Pythons were absolutely honest about it, said, we listened to the Goon Show, we thought we could do that. So there's Michael Palin, but Dawn French and Jennifer Saunders are really big fans, and then the League of Gentlemen, and, it goes right the way through. Eddie Izzard's a huge fan, Stephen Fry, a lot of British comedy had a good look at Spike and what he could do. And he was, I just noticed... he was very popular with the royal family, and Prince Charles, as a boy, obviously listened to the Goons and thought this was wonderful. And there was a massive event, I saw it on YouTube the other day, where Prince Charles gave Spike a huge tribute. And this was live, and Spike turned to him and said, you grovelling little bastard. That's to the heir to the throne. And he was saying, and I'm in the corner. I've forgotten my younger self was at this event. And my jaw just dropped. You thought, yeah, you don't care.
Yeah.
And Spike, literally, nobody knew what he'd do. He was extraordinary.
Where do you find the time to do all this, right? The editor of Private Eye, you're writing plays, and once a week-ish, you're on the TV. Pretty busy life in Hislop.
Well, I have no friends.
Yeah.
And no life.
Okay, there you go. I say, where do you find the time in your life that it's because it is your life?
I think I've always felt incredibly lucky to have the opportunities I have, and I'm very greedy with those opportunities. I really like doing what I do.
You've also exposed yourself because you opened the interview by saying that you had a conversation with a friend about your suburbia thing. So both can't be true.
Imaginary friend.
Yeah, of course. I was talking to myself. Final question, Ian. What is it that gives you hope?
The fact that in the business I'm in and the associated ones in journalism, in comedy, it's full of people who want to have their say, who believe it's worth doing this. And people will say, well, you've never achieved anything. And you think, well, maybe if we hadn't done something, it'd have been even worse. I cling to that. And I do cling to the fact that people are still so interested. And again, at the moment, I think we are in it's fairly dire politically. But people know that. It's not dire and no one's mentioned it, or it's not dire and no one cares. I mean, that I think is very hopeful. I mean, and I got quite depressed thinking about the amount of misinformation online, because, if you come from old school media, there's a certain amount of authority, a certain amount of checks and balances, a certain amount of knowing where this comes from. And there was a sort of Wild West feel to people will believe anything. But I do feel now, there's a lot of really quite classy new stuff around in terms of journalism, in terms of platforms, in terms of people addressing things. And I think, well, that's positive. That's a real counter to, the people reading American blogs in their bedroom and then coming up to you in the street and saying, let me tell you about the vaccines. That's quite lowering. Yeah. But the counterblast to that, I think, is really quite encouraging.
In Hislop, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.